and with special collaboration with Business China. And tonight we are honored to have Dr. Koh Chin Yee, Vice President for South Sea Society, a 80-year-old academic body focusing on Southeast Asia research. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Koh Chin Yee.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me this evening at this talk on China's BRI. Before I start, I would like to very briefly introduce to you the two organizations other than NLB that make possible this evening's talk. One is, of course, the South Seas Society, Nanyang Xuehui, that I represent. As mentioned by the moderator a while ago, the South Sea Society was formed almost 80 years ago in March 1940. So, of course, at that time, there was no Republic of Singapore. Singapore was still a colony under the British rule. And the Chinese scholars in 1940 in Singapore were still Chinese nationals under the Republic of China, 中华民国. So household names like Yao Nan, Xu Yunqiao, Yu Dafu, I'm sure many of these names would ring a bell in you. Our prominent members included Professor Wang Gengwu, Professor Rao Zhongyi, Professor Eddie Guo, and our current president is Professor Dang Yingchao, Cheng Rongzao from NUS. Business China. We all know that Business China was set up slightly more than a decade ago. Its patron was none other than Mr. LKY. Then when he set up, or rather when he mooted the idea of Business China, the mission is to nurture an inclusive, bilingual and bicultural group of Singaporeans through many of the events and programs that they do. Some people may misunderstand Business China as a platform, or as a chamber, or as some kind of association that helps people link up businesses in Singapore and China, or in China and elsewhere. But no, actually what Business China does primarily is to help Singaporeans and Singapore-based companies, Singapore-based individuals to know better about China. And therefore, hoping that when we do business with China, you'll become easier, you'll become more effective. So this is how the name Business China come about. So I shall now very quickly move on to the topic we are discussing this evening, BRI. So what is BRI? BRI was announced in 2013, so slightly more than 5 years ago. It was originally known as OBOR, One Belt, One Road. One Belt, One Road. So what is belt and what is road? Belt is essentially the Silk Road economic belt. If we know Silk Road in China, ancient China, it started all from as far back as the Han Dynasty, 丝绸之路. So the people from Middle East, people from Europe bought things like silk and tea leaves from China. So all these goods were transported from China all the way through the Silk Road to Middle East, to Europe. So that is the land-based road, land-based trade road. So Silk Road economic belt. Then the sea road is the one that goes from Quanzhou. Many of the Chinese in Singapore are from Fujian. And most of us who are from Fujian were actually from Minnan. And most of us from Minnan actually comes from this big mega city called Quanzhou, Zhuajiu. So Quanzhou is actually a very important seaport city in ancient China, a very important seaport city. And the Maritime Silk Road in China started from Quanzhou. So from Quanzhou, it either goes to Japan, or it goes to Philippines, or it goes to Vietnam, then from Vietnam to Thailand, from Thailand to Malaysia. Of course, that time it was known as Malaya. To Malaya, then to Singapore, then of course to Indonesia and so on. So that is the southward road, the seaward road. So in 2013, Xi Jinping mooted this idea of reviving the Belt and the Road. The aim is to revive these ancient trade routes that spans across Asia, Africa, and Europe. So immediately we think of this image come to our mind when we talk about Silk Road. And the next image that may come to our mind is this, Cheng Ho, Zheng He xia Xiyang. Zheng He xia Xiyang, he took, of course, the Sea Road. So immediately these two persons, these two major historical events came to our mind. And what else comes to our mind when we think about Belt and Road? So for many of us here who are familiar with BRI, a few terms will immediately come to our mind. China, trade. Of course, very importantly, in the middle, you see sea. Actually, I would have expected sea to come out more prominently than what it is on this chart, but it doesn't. Instead, another 2 or 3 more prominent words that came out are opportunity. Or we see opportunity. We don't somehow see the word threat here, but we see more opportunity. We also see infrastructure, we see connectivity, we see influence. So these are the few things that comes to our mind. We shall go on. But before we go on to what BRI is, I'm going to run through very quickly, bring all of us here back to history. Because if we know history, then we will know why China mooted the BRI idea. Now we go back to 2,000 years of economic history of major powers. These are the share of GDP of major powers in history. If you look on the left of this chart, it shows first century, 1. And from there onwards, year 1000, year 2015, and so on until year 2017. So if you look at year 1, you realize that China and India were the most important powers in as far as GDP is concerned in the world. And China and these two countries, these two powers remained so until sometime in the 16th century or 1700s. In the 1700s, you find that China and India were still the most important economies in the world. Now, of course, by then, by 1700s, you started to see countries like France, countries like UK, countries like Italy are becoming more important. But when it comes to 1949 is a very important year in Asia history. It is a year PRC, People's Republic of China, was born. So 1949, you realize that China and India becomes very not important. Or China, India, that two major powers in history becomes not important. They occupy about 20% in total of the world's GDP. Instead, other countries like Russia, of course, America, UK, France, Germany, Japan become more important than these two ancient powers. 1978, I draw a yellow line there, 1978, because it spells a very important year in China. And in that year, China started its reform and opening up. And that changed China's history. And therefore, that's why I draw a yellow line on 1978. Further on, in 1992, I draw a red line. You will see that from 1978 to 1992, China's economy's share of world GDP began to increase quite substantially from 1979 to 1992. And from 1992 to year 2001, it increased even quickly. Why? So what happened in 1992? Deng Xiaoping Nanxun, or Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour. Deng Xiaoping Nanxun in 1992. And in 2001, you see 2001 to 2012, the expansion rate was very fast. So from 1992, in fact from 1978 to almost sometime last year to about 5 years ago, 2012, 78 to 2012, China's GDP continued to increase at double-digit rate. Also, 2001, what happened in 2001? China's accession to WTO. And that was a very important historic event that pushes China's GDP growth very much forward. Then 2012. You realize that economically, in ancient China, in Han Dynasty, Han Tang, only when it comes to Tang Dynasty, then economic center started to shift southwards. Before Tang Dynasty, in Han, in Qing, in Chunqiu Zhangguo, there's no clear site of economic center in China. If there was, it would be in the capital. It will be in the north. But from Tang onwards, economic capital started to shift downwards to south. Until today, the bulk of Chinese economy is in coastal southern China, or coastal southern China. You see from Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong, these 4 coastal province plus Shanghai, so 4+1. So now you start to draw this picture. Most important economic activities are all in coastal China. I shall run through this very quickly. So when it comes to Ming Dynasty, while we talk about Zheng He Xia Xiyang, but we know that in most part of Ming Dynasty, sea trade was forbidden. And then southern region continue to be China's economic center. When it comes to Qing Dynasty, in some parts of Qing Dynasty, the government sometimes opened up sea trade, sometimes it continued to prohibit sea trade. Then subsequently, when it comes to 1840 Opium War, then China lost the war and was forced to sign the Nanjing Treaty, and then forced to open up 5 trading ports: Guangzhou, Fuzhou, Xiamen, Ningbo, and Shanghai, and ceded Hong Kong to the British. So from then, you start to see that China, after 1840, was forced to open up its sea trade, Before that, China was very isolated. In the 50s, 60s, until 76, China economy was in a very, very bad shape. Then I mentioned just now, 1992, Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour. Why is Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour important? Why is it important? He made a few very concrete policy guidance in 1992. So he mentioned that only reform and opening up will save China. So he used a very critical and very strong word. He says safe. So if China doesn't go that route, it will be doomed. So save and be doomed. Of course, then the white cat and black cat theory, we all know. It doesn't matter what color the cat is, as long as it catches the mouse. And he said that it is important to maintain a good economic growth rate. So do not think that GDP is not important. GDP growth is important. And most important of all, he said, whoever opposes reform will be asked to leave. And from there, we can see from 1978 to the first 3 quarters of last year, this is how Chinese economy has grown exponentially. The present China would not be what it is today without reform and opening up. In year 2000 to year 2010, China talk about this Western development strategy, 西部大开发. Why I think it's important to mention this to you, I have to go back to the point I mentioned earlier, that the center of economic activities in China shifted from the north to coastal southeastern China for the past maybe 10 centuries, or from Tang Song to now. And it remains still in this part of China, and therefore creating a very huge gap between the coastal and inland. And the further inland you go to, it becomes very unlike coastal. If you have been to cities or if you have been to cities in, for instance, central China, say Hunan, Hubei, Jiangxi, then you see that they are quite different from the coastal provinces. And if you move in even further, if you move into as far as maybe Yunnan, Tibet, if you go even west, places like Gansu, places like Ningxia, places that like Qinghai, then you realize that these places do not match your expectation of what you would see in China. Very, 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 very different. And therefore, the Chinese government and the CPC, Communist Party of China, sees that it is extremely important to try to balance economic lives of people in the coastal region and people in the inland. Otherwise, you'll give rise to a lot of social problems, political problems, law and order problems, stability problems. So China put up this Western development 西部大开发 strategy a decade ago, but it didn't really work. It didn't really work. Tons of money were pumped into this, but it did not really take off. So we see massive investments. We see, of course, rising GDPs in all the Western regions, but it fails to achieve this target of eliminating this difference. The income gap continues to rise between the coastal areas and the inland areas. Then we talk about China's WTO accession. In year 2008 and 9, China embarked under Hu Wen's time, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao's era, embarked on this program called Economic Stimulus Program. So it was a 4万亿 or 4 trillion stimulus package announced by the 国务院 State Council of PRC. Then they put up many policies that tries to boost the economy in these sectors, housing, and that is one reason why housing prices in China is extremely high today. One very important factor was the 2008 stimulus program. Then the new normal. In 2014, Xi Jinping for the first time mentioned this thing called new normal. So what is new and what is normal? The new thing about this is we all realize that from sometime from 2008, 2009, 2010, Chinese economy no longer continue to rise at a rate of double digit. So from then onwards, from 2008, 2009, China economy continued to rise at a very good rate, but no longer double digit. It becomes like 9.5, 9, then gradually 8.5 and so on. At one time, we talk about 保八, maintaining or rather keeping the economy growth rate at least 8%. So 保住, maintain at least 8. So at one time we talk about 保八, then 2-3 years ago we talk about 7%. So the new thing about this so these two words are new normal. The new refers to no longer double digit growth. So it's now single digit. So it's new because it's now single digit. And normal, what does normal means? Normal in this context refers to the single digit growth rate will become a normal. So do not expect yourself to go back to the golden era of double digit growth. It's no longer possible. 2015, talk about supply side reform. So what is supply side reform? In fact, for the past 40 years or 30 over years from 1978 to 2015, Chinese economic growth was mainly powered by external factor, or we call it the demand side factor. Demand side factors such as overseas market, overseas demand, overseas investment, overseas trade, foreign trade. All these are demand side factors. And now in 2015, Chinese leadership started to talk about supply side reform. So supply side reform talks about reform at my own end rather than at the consumer's end. So now instead of having to expand my market, having to explore new markets, they are thinking of more about how to make my products better, how to make my processes more effective, more efficient, and so on. So that is supply side reform that Chinese government raised in 2015. One very important development over the past few years is that Chinese population like ours is no longer growing. We all know about China's one-child policy. And 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years, I can't remember, China's abandoned one-child policy and started to do two-child. But very quickly, they realized that, like us, two-child policy, 打八盖, 没有用, useless. So China faces this problem. And one very important factor of China's economic growth over the last 40 years, other than reform and opening up, is the population bonus that China enjoys. But now China no longer enjoys a population bonus. Instead, it may face something we call the demographic honors. Population to you now is no longer a plus point, but might be a minus point because your population is aging. Aging is not a problem. We are all aging. Everybody is aging. Everybody has to age. Aging is not a problem. The problem occurs when an aging society or an aging economy is unable to reform itself to match the new requirements, the new characteristics of an aging society. And that kind of reform or that kind of transition might be easier for a very small economy like ours than for a big economy, a big country like China. So for us, you see that even for Singapore, we have this big problem. Another very important challenge that China faces today is the hollowing out of industries. Hollowing out. So industries, especially manufacturing industries that employs most of the workers in China, are hollowing out in China. Hollowing out means they are shifting away from China. First, they shifted away from the coastal cities to inland because coastal cities becomes more expensive to hire people. So you shifted from coastal to inland. Gradually, you realize that inland may be also more not as attractive. So you start to shift to places like Vietnam, which is cheaper. And gradually, they may even shift further. They may even shift further. So that is one, about rising HR costs. The other thing is about AI, advances in technology such as AI. We may not realize that in fact AI has and will continue to change our economic life so much that you can imagine if one day you can manufacture, say, iPhone. If you can manufacture iPhone using fully automated production lines without having 10 workers, now you may have only 1 worker per line. So if you do that, then manpower cost to you is not important anymore. It's not important anymore. So whether you produce iPhone in China or you produce iPhone in India or you produce iPhone in US, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter as far as human cost is concerned. In fact, it may be even cheaper to produce in US because all your technology, all your things are there. Also, advances in technology such as AI may inspire manufacturers to relocate. And also another reason, another factor for hollowing out of industries from China is that foreign investments may be hesitant in either continue to invest in China or to even put in more investment in China. Inadequate IPR protection. And one very important factor is rising tax burdens. Because in the past, before China's accession to WTO and shortly after China's accession, China continues to give tax incentives to foreign businesses, like we did to foreign investors. China did the same. But gradually, under WTO's rule, these incentives cannot go on forever. So China starts to retract some of these incentives, and then foreign business, of course, find it. Now I have to start paying tax like my Chinese partners do, like my Chinese counterparts do. That is, of course, a hesitant factor for them. Then we talk about China Dream that Xi Jinping mentioned. So he said that China Dream is about Chinese prosperity, collective effort, not only individual but collective effort, about socialism and about national glory. So you start to see that China under Xi Jinping's era thinks and behaves quite differently from China under Jiang Zemin's era, China under Hu Jintao's era. Because China is, I think because of two factors. First, the external factor. China is no longer what China was during Hu during Jiang's era, and of course during Deng Xiaoping's era. So China is much stronger than it was. So this is the external factor. Under him, CPC mentioned these 2 centennial goals, or by 2021, which is 2 years from now, 2021, China would want to build 小康社会, 全面, or prosperous society in all respects. That's 2 years from now. And 30 years from now, by 2049, China will want to build a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, and so on. Also, remember these 2 goals. Remember these 2 goals, especially the 2049 goal. 2049 goal, prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious. This is a very important thing to keep in mind. In short, from what I've said, you will see some mega trends that China's economic growth is now in a new normal and needs new engines of growth externally. And China needs to narrow its coastal inland gap. As far as geopolitics is concerned, China is now more connected to the world as compared to 30, 40 years ago. So it sees more value in globalization, as well as the need in playing a more prominent role in global leadership. So now you start to see China talking more, appearing more in global leadership. And because of US action or lack of action, you see that there's some degree of a power vacuum in Asia. And this, when coupled with the rise of China's economic power, inspires her to pursue a leadership role and a strong nation dream, 强国梦, or 强国梦, strong nation dream. And with this great revival of the Chinese people. And in the area of ideology, you see that despite this new normal, which happened since 3 years ago, China's growth over the past 4 decades has been very spectacular. And she wishes to offer this model as a reference vis-a-vis the US model. So this is a very important factor to keep in mind. Also, not only the US model can lead you to success, but my model you should also consider. So this is a very important factor. And one of the answers to all these mega trends is BRI. And the BRI was incorporated into the constitution of the CPC 2 years ago in 2017. So BRI is now written in CPC's constitution. So it becomes a principle. Okay, so just now we mentioned, I show you a more simpler map. Now you see this more complex map. In the north, you see the green belt, or the green belt. That is a land-based belt. Linking China, you'll see that the green belt starts from central China, not from coastal. So that tells a story already. Why it doesn't start from coastal? Because there's no point doing the coastal thing anymore. Now you want to grow. Now you want to shift, or rather now you want to narrow the gap between coastal and inland. Therefore, BRI starts from the lesser developed region of inland province. So let's talk about the belt first. Belt links from Chongqing, Wuhan, Chongqing, all the way to western China, Kashgar in Xinjiang. Then from Kashgar to Zhongya, Middle Asia, then to Middle East, to Eastern Europe, and then finally to Western Europe. You have several infrastructure. For instance, there is this major railway linking EU from Zhejiang. Zhejiang is coastal, of course. Linking EU. You see that little dot. You see EU. So that little dot has a railway that links it to Xinjiang and then further to Europe. So in China, it is called 易新欧铁路. 义乌新疆义新欧铁路. 义乌新疆欧洲义新欧 义乌新疆 and Europe railway. So that railway is already here in black color, the black line. Now we talk about the route, MSR, Maritime Silk Road, which is of course sea-based. Maritime Silk Road starts from Quanzhou, no doubt it starts from Quanzhou, but the more important road is actually starts from Guangxi. Or the more important route starts from Guangxi, from here, downwards. So from Guangxi downwards, where to? Downwards to Vietnam, then to Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and then from Singapore they make the way back to Myanmar, to South Asia, then to the eastern coast of Africa, and from eastern coast of Africa through Suez Canal back to Europe again. So that is the sea route. And other than this, of course, if you have land route, we expect infrastructure developments like railway stations, all sorts of highways. If you have the sea route, of course, we expect all sorts of seaports. But other than seaports, other than railways, other than highways, you would also start to see two very important infrastructure developments. One is oil pipeline. The other one is gas pipeline, oil and gas. So these two are also very important infrastructure in BRI. BRI is further classified or further divided into 6 economic corridors. You will see the China, Mongolia, Russia economic corridor. So that spans the northmost region from east to west. So China, Mongolia, Russia. Then next you have the new Euro-Asia land bridge. So that is essentially the Yixing-O railway that I mentioned earlier, Yixing-O. Then on the east, you have the China-Indochina Peninsula Economic Corridor. That links China all the way to Singapore. And the railway project was supposed to link all the way from Kunming, then to Thailand, from Thailand, then to Malaysia, and finally to Singapore. On the west of this, you have the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, essentially the South Asia-China Economic Corridor. Then further, you have one very important corridor, that is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the only corridor under BRI that is only 2 countries. The rest are all more than 2 countries. So China-Pakistan started very early, started to see early results. Then finally, you have the China, Central Asia, and West Asia Economic Corridor. Some basic narrative on BRI. BRI is poised to be the most ambitious and all-encompassing economic development program in human history. It aims to link all this I need not talk about anymore. The third point is important. BRI territories makes up 2/3 of the world's landmass, and it could affect as many as 4.4 billion people in 65 countries. Also, if we go back to this map, you'll see that essentially, other than the 2 North and South America and Australia, almost all parts of the world is included in this BRI initiative. Okay, objectives. So what are the objectives? Why do China moot the idea of BRI? I think there are, of course, 2 sets of objectives. One is internal, the other one is external. So internally, it has to sustain the new normal of growth. Just now, remember I talked about Baoba, or keeping the GDP growth at least 8%. Then gradually it became 7%. And last year, I think it was 6.9. And for 2 consecutive quarters, third quarter and fourth quarter, it continued to be 6.9 and 6.9. No doubt, you continue to go weaker. So China has this very important task of making sure that its economy continue to grow. If Chinese economy doesn't grow, then it will have problem providing jobs. The moment you have problem providing jobs, you will have problem with stability. And also you will have problem with people paying for their housing loans. And if people cannot pay housing loans, then all sorts of other problems. You can all imagine the chain of action or the chain of reaction that follows when people are unable to find jobs. So BRI is also to boost Chinese domestic economy, to stimulate the weak industries, and also to help the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, find an avenue of utilizing their excess capacity. So we all know that China in the past 20 years spent a lot of effort and resources in building infrastructure. I was working in Shanghai, Jiangsu from 2002 to Shanghai, Jiangsu and Beijing in 2002 to 2010. I'll talk about Shanghai per se. During these 9 years, we see so many infrastructure developments. In the past 2002, when I first stationed in Shanghai, I think Shanghai to Jiangsu there were only 2 highways, and the other one is linking Shanghai to Huning Gaosu, linking Shanghai to Nanjing, and there was only I think two important bridges. One is Nanjing Daqiao, 3 Nanjing Daqiao, and then the Jiangying Daqiao. Only 3 bridges at that time between Jiangsu and Shanghai. But now, Jiangsu across this Yangtze River, I think you have at least 7 or 8 bridges, at least 7 or 8. Then from Shanghai to Zhejiang also, and numerous highways, 各种各样的高速公路, numerous. Of course, high-speed rail that makes it so convenient. In the past, when we went to Beijing from Shanghai, we always have to take a flight. Then after that, we take the overnight trains. We sleep in the train. Next morning, early morning, we reach Beijing. Now, I think it's about 6 hours or so. Very super convenient. But all this convenience and all this infrastructure network came about because Chinese SOEs put in a lot of resources and effort into building this. Right now, most of it has been developed, so it will not go on. It will not be, the speed will not be so fast anymore. Then now all this excess capacity will have to go somewhere. So things like raw materials, machinery, capabilities, experience, engineers, workers have to go somewhere. So where to? BRI is an answer. The other one is Chinese banks. With BRIs, then Chinese bank will be able to offer loans and other instruments to help to developing countries, and who in turn will contract Chinese enterprises to do their projects. So these are internal. External factors, of course, is to deepen China's trade ties with the region, to expand bilateral trade and investment volumes, and to further China's FDI. So just now we talked about Chinese infrastructure spending. So from this chart, you will see how strong, how capable China was from 1992 to 2011. And that is only to 2011. From 2011 to 2017, 2016, there were a lot more infrastructure being built in China. And if you compare this chart, if you see this chart, you compare PRC just to the world. World is in the middle. World is about 4%. The world average is to spend about 4% on infrastructure spending. But China spends about 9%. 9%, double the world's average. So this shows how much capacity China has as far as infrastructure spending, as far as infrastructure development is concerned. And in BRI, the priority is about infrastructure connectivity. So that is the priority. I will not go into details, but that is only priority. Other than this priority, what other things are important? One very important thing is about policies. So other than having the network of facilities, network of infrastructure to help you move goods and services, to help you move people, to help you move money, equally important is to have the open policy that allows you to do that. You may have all the networks, you may have all the connectivity, but if your policy, if your government policy says that no, you cannot sell to America, no, if you cannot send money to Singapore, then there's no use to have all this connectivity. So having infrastructure is important. Having open door policy is also very important. So I must stress that BRI has infrastructural connectivity as a priority, but not entirely. We must always remember, not entirely. And of course, BRI brings about opportunities. Or you can imagine if China has so much capacity to share with the world, then what kind of opportunity it can bring to the world? AIIB is of course mooted and set up by China. It is now the CEO, the bank governor is a Chinese. There are challenges that China faces as far as BRI is concerned. I will go through very quickly. One very important thing. This topic we're talking about today is the opportunities and implications. I wouldn't say threats. Implications of BRI. Let's focus on MSR, Maritime Silk Road, MSR, which is directly relevant to us in Singapore and to Southeast Asia. So different Southeast Asia countries has different opinion on BRI. We can broadly classify them into 3 groups. Countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, the 3 countries that are almost nearest to China as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. These 3 countries are most supportive of BRI. They are generally very positive on the proposed BRI initiatives in the region. Then the next set, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, generally we have a very good overall support for MSR, so there's some degree of reservation. Then the third set, Brunei, Vietnam, Philippines, they have no strong political consensus within themselves on whether they should intensify cooperation with China. There is this trust deficit between China and some ASEAN members. While we said that BRI has started from mooted in 2013 and started in 2014, some projects have failed. So in late 2017, Sri Lanka government had to hand over a port to a Chinese firm on a 99-year list because the country, Sri Lanka, was unable to service its debt. And this incident raised alarm. Some BRI countries started to ask themselves, these projects are not cheap. In fact, Mahathir has a good point when he decided to halt or to cancel the 2 projects he has with China, or Malaysia has with China, because he said that if we continue with these 2 projects, Malaysia will be bankrupt. So these are mega projects that cost a lot of money. So some BRI countries began to ask themselves, what happens if I cannot pay? To many countries is a form of surrender of your rights. So they cannot do that. So Myanmar scaled back their project in last August. So a port that was designed to develop 10 berths was reduced to only 2. Then of course we all know the Malaysia case. So why did these BRI projects fail? Because of either one of these factors or a combination of these factors. It could be domestic politics, a change of government, a change of ruling party. So ruling party A favors China. That was overthrown in an election. Ruling party B became the new government and decided that why should I be so close to China? Why should I get Chinese to do this project that cost me this bomb? So domestic politics. Geopolitics. Governments may not have changed. It may be the same government, but they become wary. They begin to think that, would I be inviting too much Chinese interest into my country or into the region? Environment and ecology is also a factor. Sometimes the local community thinks that this dam that my government is building with Chinese company is causing ecological problem to my community. So they oppose to that project. Corruption and rent seeking. You can imagine if you are a province governor in some underdeveloped countries and now you have this mega project costing you hundreds of millions of dollars, then would you want to take a bite? Would you want to take 5%, 10%? So corruption and rent seeking. Sometimes it's about the project having no visible spin-off to the country. For instance, some countries complain that the Chinese managers bring in Chinese workers, bring in Chinese engineers. They do not employ us. So there's no spin-off. We borrow money from the Chinese to build this mega project. Then we are in debt. but there's no spin-off to the economy. The final factor is some projects are politically driven, so they may not be economically viable. So this could be a reason why they fail. Or some are progressing well. One good example is the International Land Sea Trade Corridor that we do under the Chongqing Connectivity Initiative, CCI, Chongqing Connectivity Initiatives. So you can read this readily available on the internet about the MOU signed between Chan Chun Sing and the Chinese on the 12th of November. So this project that we do will link Belt and the MSR. Chongqing is the start point of MSR as well as the start point of the Belt. So by doing our third government-to-government project in Chongqing, Singapore government hopes to ride on the BRI by linking both the Belt and the route and help to enhance the connectivity between Western China, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world. But there are some events that call themselves BRI, and sometimes I personally find it a bit puzzling why they are called BRI. You can see on the top right, this is done by this golf tournament was organized by my friend in 2017. So then I asked him, hey, what is BRI? Oh, it was known as Belt and Road. Oh, it was known as OBOR at that time. So why is your golf tournament got to do with BRI? I can't remember the reason he gave, but I think the motivation was to link as much as possible, to link yourself, your event, your company, your product, your services, your brand name to BRI, because that is the pet of the Chinese the Chinese government now. So try to link yourself with that so that they will like you more. Then on the left you see 一带一路茶文化. You talk about tea. So tea with 一带一路. Then you have this model show. BRI model show, I don't know, but the model all looks like Chinese. Yeah. I would have expected maybe some BRI faces, different races, different ethnic, but no, it looks all Chinese. Anyway, during 2016 and 2017, early 2017, when Singapore and China had this little saga over the South China Sea issue, many netizens in China like to say that Singapore opposes BRI, Singapore hates BRI, Singapore hates China, but in fact it is not. As early as 2014, when Cai Xing's Hu Suli, chief editor Hu Suli, interviewed Lee Hsien Loong, she asked, in all the developed countries, Singapore is the only one that supports AIIB. AIIB, we all know, is part of the instruments to support BRI. So Singapore is the only country in the developed world that supports AIIB. And Lee Hsien Loong said, Singapore supports AIIB because we think that it has value and it can do good contribution. Because new countries, developing countries needs lots of investment in infrastructure. And China's BRI and AIIB, of course, we in ASEAN supports it. So this gives a very strong backing to Singapore's support of BRI as early as 2014. And why, if we ask ourselves, just now we mentioned that some projects in BRI fail, and they fail because of those factors I put in yellow boxes. So why does Singapore still support BRI? In fact, we should support it because your BRI in all these countries are business opportunities to our service providers. They are opportunities to our bankers, to our lawyers, to our consultants, to our master planners, to our port operators, and so on and so forth. So, Uri Tana got money, or at least there is opportunity to earn money. So a few things, and also as a China expert, we may think that some of us may may think that, hey, we do not know China well enough. And indeed, some of us may not know China well enough. But if we compare ourselves to many of these BRI countries, we find that, in fact, Singapore might be one of the better qualified China experts as far as BRI is concerned. We might know China a bit more than our neighbors in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Africa. So if we are a China expert, we may have experience to share and to sell. And this is why we support BRI. And one very important thing is China also thinks that Singapore has a good and large role to play in BRI. Last year, China signs a MOU with us on appointing Singapore to work with China on third-party markets, exploring markets. So why does China think that Singapore has a good role to play? Our ambassador in China, Singapore's ambassador in China, Stanley Low, shared also in a Business China forum like this, of course a much smaller forum, I think it was sometime last May or last June. And he mentioned one point that I remembered. He said that many Chinese projects or many Chinese investment projects might be seen as, I mentioned earlier, might be seen as politically driven and therefore not economically viable. But Singaporeans, you and I, and many of them out there, are known to be kiasu kiasi and then kia bo lui. So why would we, as individuals, as companies, want to invest, want to take part in a project that is politically driven and that is not economically viable? No. I think everywhere we go, people ask about ROI, return on investments, and so on. So Singaporeans are known for wanting to make money. And therefore, that becomes a very good yardstick for measuring whether this project is politically driven or is economically viable. If Singaporeans are involved, then more likely it is economically viable. So that becomes a yardstick that other countries, third-party countries, may use to measure. And therefore, China needs Singapore to be involved to give this assurance to the third country. So before I end, I would like to share this picture that we all know very well of. And that goes back to the theme or to the objective of this talk. Why do NLB and Business China do this talk? I think it's back to the name Eye on Asia. So to help us know better about Asia. And today, of course, we focus on China to help us know better on China. So be China savvy. I think that is the fundamental, that is the bottom line of Business China's existence. To me, I think that is the bottom line. And to be China savvy, I think we need to keep ourselves abreast of developments in China. So I always come across a few very different groups of people. One group that always think that we know very well about China, we are China experts, nobody knows China better than we do. There is this group. And there's another group that thinks China is too far ahead of Singapore. There's no way Singapore can be of value to anyone since China is there already. China will snatch all our businesses away. There's no way we can compete. There's also this group of people. I think we must strike a balance. We must strike a balance. If we go to China and if we spend enough time and if we open our eyes big enough and open our hearts and open our minds big enough, then we realize that, of course, in China, as in any other things, it exists opportunities and also it exists some threats. Of course, China is a threat to us because it's too big. But of course, China is also an opportunity to us, simply also because it's too big. So be China savvy, try to be as open-minded as we can, especially on a day-to-day basis, we will come across news and information on China that can be very different. One day you may hear that China is doing so well in this. For instance, a week ago or 5 days ago, you hear that China starts to explore the far side of the moon. That is the first time in mankind history we are doing this. So this is something that we have to respect China for. nobody can do that. They do it the first time. So you may hear very different things of China. So important thing is be open-minded and read as extensively as you can. So that is the last advertisement I will do. So with that, thank you very much for spending this evening with me.
Thank you, Dr. Koh.